In other news, the American empire is dying, according to an entire generation of people.
Yeah.
It's really what we have in front of us. We can put this first tear sheet up on the screen. A dying empire led by bad people. That's just the headline. Poll finds young voters despairing over U.S. politics. Actually, a very accurate encapsulation of this poll, which is from Blueprint. Young voters overwhelmingly believe that almost all politicians are corrupt. Amen. And that the country will end up worse off than when they were born. Blueprint is a Democratic firm. We should note Semaphore got this polling exclusively. So it was an online poll of 18 to 30-year-old registered voters, which is actually interesting, Krystal, because a lot of people who probably have even more cynical impressions of the country and the country's future are simply not registered to vote. So if anything, this is probably undercounting the way people feel about the country, because if you're not registered to vote, you probably already lack, I think, hope in a lot of cases. Not everyone who's not registered to vote. Some people just aren't really into politics and don't want to vote, which is perfectly understandable. But for a lot of people, they're just like, well, I'm not going to vote. Why am I going to vote? What do you want me to choose from, this corrupt politician or the other corrupt politician, which was what we were talking about, in fact, earlier in the show. So of 943 18 to 30-year-old registered voters, Blueprint, this Dem firm, asked them to respond to a series of questions about the American political system. 49% agreed to some extent that elections in the country don't represent people like them. 51% agreed to some extent that the political system in the U.S., quote, doesn't work for people like me. And 64% backed the statement that, quote, America is in decline. A whopping 65% agreed either strongly or somewhat that, quote, nearly all politicians are corrupt and make money from their political power. Now, I will say, also, only 7% disagreed with the article notes.
I want to know who those 7% are.
It's actually really good. Those are the 7% of voters are the people that will actually go for Biden, like the youth for Biden. Like, it's just all them.
It's just Harry Sisson.
Yes. Yes. But it's also worth noting that that wording is so funny to me because it says, you're either somewhat agreeing that nearly all politicians are corrupt. Like, it's so, the way that it's worded is so, hedging. You know what I mean? You somewhat agree that nearly all politicians are corrupt. That's just, how could anyone disagree with that? Who are the 7% of these people? Well, the Semaphore continues, well, 45% of people polled said their own lives would be either a lot or a little bit better than their parents. The same wasn't true for how they felt America as a whole is doing. 54% believed the country is going downhill. I feel like, Krystal, maybe there are a lot of Breaking Points viewers in here. We can start to put some of these numbers up on the screen. This is D2. D2 is America's jaded youth vote. This is, doesn't matter who wins elections, nothing changes. Strongly agree. 28%, 20%, somewhat agree, 28%, somewhat disagree and strongly disagree. Those are only at 13% respectively. So that's only 26% of 18 to 30-year-olds who disagree.
Who say that elections may somewhat matter.
Exactly. It's 26%.
Just... And then, Emily, think about the pitch that Biden is making to young voters. That your life is literally on the line in this election.
Yes.
That's how much it matters. And then you look at these numbers, they just don't agree with you.
Right.
They just don't agree with you.
And he desperately needs young voters.
Yeah.
Desperately needs young voters, because we've seen not just young voters falling away from Joe Biden, but some polling finds on the margins where it's really going to matter for Joe Biden in a state like Wisconsin, where those college towns are super influential. And that's, swing states all over. Those college towns are very influential in the swing states. People actually moving to Trump from Biden. And Trump is making a similarly existential pitch. So it's not as though Trump is out here being like,
it's fine either way.
Make America, or keep America great, which was his pitch in 2020. Oof, that was rough as an incumbent.
Yeah, even he didn't like that one.
No.
Never really leaned into it.
No.
Yeah, I love a dying empire led by bad people. I feel like that should be the name of our election coverage for 2024. Nails it pretty well, I would say.
We should put that on a mug.
There you go.
Dying empire
led by bad people. Who could disagree? I mean, honestly, I know they only focus on 18 to 30-year-olds, but I think you would find a lot of similar sentiments, especially in the next age group up, like millennial / Gen X. I think you would see a lot of similar sentiments. And then as you got older, you would find people who were a little bit more positive and a little more hopeful about the electoral system and felt like more was on the line with regard to this election. That's why older voters have stuck with Joe Biden. People who voted for Joe Biden last time around, the one cohort that is really sticking with him very strongly is older voters. And so, again, it speaks to how not compelling their pitch is to this demographic that they desperately need, and why all of the voter shaming that you see around, especially the unconditional support for Israel, is also not effective. It's just like, oh, how dare you say anything critical of Joe Biden? Don't you know you're helping Trump? And for young people who, like me, see this as a genocide and see it as a stark moral line, that's just not going to be a compelling pitch. You have to change the policy, and there is no sign that they have any intention of changing the policy. So, yeah, it's pretty dire numbers. It's huge trouble for Joe Biden. The fact that it's a Democratic polling firm actually is significant because it means they would, kind of be inclined towards showing some more favorable numbers towards Joe Biden. But it's also just a dire statement about how decrepit and, how in decline the state of our democracy is when you have this many people in, younger generations, which are supposed to be the most idealistic, the most hopeful about the future, saying, no, I don't have that hope. I don't think things are getting better. I don't think there's an inevitability of progress. I think we're backsliding and going in the wrong direction. I mean, those are dire warning signs for the country as a whole.
Imagine trying to do those old school rock the vote campaigns with this generation. Seriously. And that brings me to the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is super fascinating data here from the Washington Post. When America was great, according to data, we can start to put some of these next charts up on the screen, but just reading from the Post's analysis. Okay, so for haters, there's no time like the present. That's what the Post found. That's how they phrased what they found. And if you're listening to this, what you're seeing on your screen is huge spikes starting around the late 2010s on questions of, this is the time with the most political division, the least reliable news reporting, the least close-knit communities, and the least moral society. You have a pretty consistent number in all cases on those questions from the 1930s until about, I would say most of those start to slightly glow up around like 2000.
Yeah.
If you're looking at it, but then after like 2015, 2010, just an insane spike. Like I can't even.
A little bit of recency bias here, I'd say.
Yeah, and
it looks a little bit.
It looks exactly like a backwards L. I guess. I mean, it's not quite a J because that line is so flat for all of them, and then goes up so starkly. Like, it really does look like a backwards L here.
Yeah.
And as we keep going through these charts, because there's more interesting stuff here. Most crime, least happy families.
Most crime is a funny one because that's actually like measurable.
Yes. Yeah. And the 80s and 90s.
Like other things are an opinion, the least happy family, even the worst economy. The only one, even the worst economy, people have now rated worse than the 1930s.
That one looks more like a U.
Yeah, that's the only one where it comes close.
Yes, because it's also very high in the 1930s and then pretty consistent throughout the mid-century, throughout the whole century, actually, between 1930 and, again, like 2010, roughly. So that's an interesting one. And but again, the rest of these look like backwards L's. We keep moving through the data here.
The worst radio
This is good. Worst music. It's not quite as severe a spike as the political ones, but you still see a decent spike around 2010. Worst television looks similar to worst music. Worst radio programming goes up around, 2010 as well. And worst movies. Also goes up around maybe like 2000 on that one. So basically across the board, what you're seeing is an increase in, let's say, this is the best way to put it. Across the board, you're seeing steep increases in, let's say, dissatisfaction with American culture.
You know what's funny, though, is they also asked the opposite question. They asked, when was the best radio programming and the best sporting events and the best television? And there was a lot of recency bias there, too, where there were a lot of people who were picking now in terms of the best. Now, it wasn't as, clear-cut as those just, backwards L-shaped graphs that Emily was describing. But like for the best television, you have very clearly, the current moment winning out, the best sporting events, the current moment, the best cuisine, it was like off the charts, the current moment, best work-life balance was the current moment won out over other decades. So you just have, people who are feeling like, whether it's the best or the worst, they feel very strongly about the present, I guess. So it is recency bias. I think the worst one, I think it just speaks to this deep sense, similar to the semaphore polling about the sense that it's, a dying empire led by bad people, of decline.
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
Things are degrading and things are chaotic and things are going off the rails. And, I'm like expressing that in all of these different venues, even in things like the best radio programming or the worst radio programming, the worst news reporting, et cetera.
Well, and starting in 1930, you're between the two world wars. And so the 20th century, despite two horrific world wars, there was just a lot of hope in the West. The West was a very hopeful place after sort of enduring those two incredible tribulations. And people came out of them with a lot of hope. And it's just very interesting that the hope is what's, I think, being sucked out. And you see that in some of these numbers. I think we have a couple more numbers. We have more elements in this block just to run through. Yeah, worst fashion, most war, shortest life expectancy. Oh, my goodness. Worst sporting events. Actually, the shortest life expectancy one is interesting because it did start to decrease. American life expectancy did start to decrease right around where people start picking up on that in the graph.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and obviously
we have a lot of war too.
Yes, and you see that spike in the roughly looks like the 1940s, which makes sense. But then during the Cold War period, where there were wars all over the place, it wasn't really that cold of a war because we were fighting or aiding people in hot wars all around the country or around the world. That was different. And do we have one more element here? Yeah, fewest scientific breakthroughs. That's a loss of hope too. It feels like you see an increase there. That's Ross Douthat's book on decadence. I highly recommend reading that one.
That is a good book.
Least racial equality starts to spike. It was higher in the 1930s. Least gender equality higher in the 1930s, but starts to spike again around the 2010s. A lot of this, Krystal, I also see there's some fascinating studies on how media influences the way we see race relations, that when media coverage, for example, if you ask people how many shootings of unarmed black men there are, or actually just black Americans there are, people will wildly overestimate it in times of media coverage that's really heavy. And it also reminds me of some of these other things too. Just you can see how when the media is telling us one thing, we're really receptive to the media narrative despite how much we hate the media.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this sort of innate to the human experience. We always overestimate something either that we experience or that we're like seeing on the news, how prevalent it is, whatever that thing is in society. So like, the life expectancy thing makes sense because we just covered on this show how our life expectancy is here in the US is declining at a pretty rapid clip, and that it's unique to the U.S.
Yeah.
Other developing nations, we have the lowest life expectancy of any G7 developed nation, and they aren't trending in the same direction we are.
Yep.
So it is a very specific U.S. trend. So there's been, I would say, actually not nearly enough coverage of that, but there has been some coverage of it. And so that contributes to a sense of not only is it declining, but actually it's the worst that it's ever been. Well, that's obviously not the case. But, as humans have a funny way of processing things. This next, put up D4, because this is interesting too in terms of how our partisan valence impacts the way that we see things. Now, this has been the case for quite a while. When you have a Republican president in office, Republicans are much more likely to say the economy's great. And Democrats are much more likely to say the economy's trash. And you can see how things totally reverse course. The instant that Joe Biden is elected in 2020, suddenly Democrats feel pretty good about the economy and Republicans take a dive off a cliff. Now, I will say, if we look overall here, you can see that Democrats, even under Joe Biden, do not reach the levels of positive economic sentiment that Republicans did under Donald Trump. And so, if you look overall, the economic sentiment was overall, on average, much higher under Donald Trump than it is under Joe Biden. And you can see independents also had a much higher opinion of the economy under Donald Trump than they do under Joe Biden. So, to take those overall numbers is in some ways more important, but the partisan split is nevertheless interesting, that people on a dime, when it's Trump in office, the very next day when Joe Biden is inaugurated, suddenly you're like, oh, actually, I think the economy's getting better. I like it.
Well, and another thing is Democrats now tend to be more affluent, and so they're more invested in the stock market, which is a change. Obviously, it wasn't always like that, but it's been a flip, and a small one for now. But I think that's still relevant here, that when the stock market is doing well, it doesn't mean the economy is great, although that's what they tell you constantly on CNBC, and sometimes they add nuance to it, but it's not the same thing. Like a great stock market isn't the same thing as a great economy.
Yeah.
And that chart actually reminded me too of the crime numbers we showed, because it's again, when the media, you were pointing out, crime in the 80s and 90s. I mean, we're going to get to this in just a second. Let's put D5 up on the screen. Which decade would you most want to live in? You can see Republicans really into the 80s. Democrats less into the 80s.
Independents also into the 80s.
Yeah, independents into the 80s.
Democrats loving the now.
But just in terms of crime, as we were talking about, again, people forget how bad it was in cities in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And D.C. is a good example of that.
Yeah.
Media coverage about crime is reasonably tough in what's happening here in D.C. But even here in D.C. is not, we're not at the levels that we were in D.C. in the 90s. Yeah, it's actually not even close.
And also, this is another one you're talking about, shootings of black men. This is another one where the media narrative really fuels a misperception, because there has been a crime spike, but actually the violent crimes have abated almost across the board in the country in the past year. But there is very little public awareness of that because of, when crime is covered, you feel like, oh, there's crime everywhere. And since there is a more significant amount of coverage of crime, that can lead to misperceptions about what the overall numbers are. So you feel like, oh, this is the worst crime we've ever seen in American history. But just by the numbers, that's clearly not the case.
And this is super interesting. Let's end on D6 here, because it sort of speaks to the psychology that's going on. The Washington Post writes, so we looked at the data another way, measuring the gap between each person's birth year and their ideal decade. So that's what we're breaking down here. The consistency of the resulting pattern delighted us. It shows that Americans feel nostalgia not for a specific era, but for a specific age. The good old days when America was, quote, great aren't the 1950s. They're whatever decade you were 11. Your parents knew the correct answer to any question, and you'd never heard of war crimes, tribunals, microplastics, or improvised explosive devices, or when you were 15 and athletes and musicians still played hard and hadn't sold out. Not every flavor of nostalgia peaks as sharply as music does, but by distilling them to the most popular age for each question, we can chart a simple life of nostalgia. Now, Krystal, I actually think what is incredibly sad to me when I read this is I don't think Gen Z and what Gen Alpha, the generation behind Gen Z, is. This is a pattern that is consistent across the last roughly 100 years, every generation alive right now. If you look at these Washington Post numbers, I don't know that this is going to be true. I'm actually very doubtful that this will be as true for those generations, because if you look at, have you seen how viral, it's just so depressing, how viral the videos that are just people's old camcorder recordings of a day in the life of a high schooler in 1999 have gone on YouTube?
No, not aware of this.
It's not people like you and me watching it. It's Gen Z. They're watching these time capsules, these windows into what life looked like before cell phones, and that's how they react to the videos. That everyone seems so happy. It seems so simple. And in the Washington Post description here, they say, your parents knew the correct answer to any question. You never heard of war crimes, tribunals, microplastics, or IEDs. Well, if you are young right now, if you're 11 right now, the decade that you're 11 right now, you're on social media, and whether you want to see this stuff or not, you are.
Yeah, my son is literally about to turn 11, so he's right in there. I mean, it's funny with this stuff, because on the one hand, I feel like there were a lot of things that were superior about like the pre-smartphone
Agree.
era. I mean, the smartphone was really the tipping point, right?
I think so.
And
I think that's why you see a lot of those numbers spike around 2010.
there was more like human connection, more seeing each other in person, more ability to disconnect from the news, and less like, you know, social media bullying and all of that sort of stuff. On the other hand, would I want to get rid of my smartphone? No. You know, because like obviously there's positive. I mean, to me, when I think back about when I started driving when I was 16, and I didn't have Google Maps, I was printing out, at least I was like printing out MapQuest.
Yeah.
Back before that, when you had a real ass map trying to get places, how did anyone get? That is crazy to me.
The amount of like soccer games that it was like, I'm going to be 5 minutes late, not for the warm up, but for the game, because my mom was like missing a street, and I used to be like, well, what are you doing? Just like get to the soccer game, and now I'm like, I couldn't do that. It's like, what do you mean turn on this road and then turn on that road? You want me to remember the directions?
And even with the MapQuest, like you miss a turn. It's not updating automatically where you now have new directions. Okay, we'll take this other route. No, you missed a turn. Like, what are you gonna do?
You can't readjust. You have to like unfold the map in the glove box.
Yeah.
Reroute.
So I mean,
stop at a gas station and ask for directions.
Yeah, I had to do that. I was trying to get to University of Maryland. It was terrifying. I missed the exits
because you were going to
Maryland. Because there were like, you know, it's where 495 and I don't know, something 270 or something splits off, and I missed whatever I was supposed to do, and I was like, I'm just not gonna find it. I'm not going to find it. This is never going to happen. So there are some things that are more positive about that.
Definitely. And we've just like stumbled into the biggest conversation of our generations about like the benefits of some of this like hyper modern social media based technology, like the smartphone and everything. So yeah, we could go on we could do a whole episode on this alone.
Yeah.
I would give up my smartphone though.
You would?
I would brave the maps. No, I can't do it because I'll miss the text from Sagar, the memes from Sagar.
Like, Emily, we need you to fill in.
Or Sagar sending like Andrew Schultz clips. Can't miss that.
Yeah, exactly. You can't give it up. I did think it was super interesting. This tracks with what probably we all experience, especially as some of us get older. But that it's so consistent. Whenever you were 15, basically, is when you thought the music was the best.
It's SNL phenomenon, yeah.
Whenever you were 11 is when you say families were the closest.
Yeah.
Whenever you were like 19 is when you think that music events and fashion, like things that you're starting to get into once you get older, you're starting to get a job and have money to do these things, that's when you think that was the peak. And across generations, it's super, super consistent. Those things I think will be the same for Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Like I think they'll feel like the music of their, you know, youth was the pinnacle of music. The Drake Kendrick beef was the pinnacle of artistic creation, or
that's what Mac will think when producer Mac is interviewed by a pollster. 30 years from now, he'll be like, "Oh yeah, remember that Drake Kendrick?
That was the golden era.
We've never had it better. Never had it better." Although,
speaking of music of my era,
I was gonna say,
yeah.
Don't date yourself, Krystal.
It's too late for that, guys.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.